So I'm Brittany. I am an efficiency consultant, and I've been studying workflow and productivity for, I guess, almost a decade, apparently. So what is productivity? Productivity, ideally, is flow. And what flow is, it's a state of knowing exactly where you're going to go next and how you're going to get there. So it's sort of an unconscious period of really high productivity where you're just you're in the zone. And so up here is a list of another guy who's working on productivity, sort of his list for what exactly it means. But basically, it's those times in which you are working on a project and then all of a sudden you look up and it's been 5 hours and you're like, whoa, where did time go? That is generally characteristic of a flow state. So why do you want to get flow? This guy, I cannot pronounce his name, is kind of like the leading expert on flow. And basically, what flow means is sort of bypassing societal and other pushes for what you goal-oriented thinking into your own autonomous doing things for your own reward. It's basically restructuring your consciousness so that every moment that you are working on something is heading towards your own defined goals. This is just slightly more complicated because it all comes from within. So it's not just something that you're oh, let me have the list of rules that I can follow to be productive and in a flow state. It really is very dependent on many factors, including your own emotions and will, and it's that 2-week drop-off point. You need to repeat it again and again and again, and if you do not repeat it, if you don't stick true to following your own defined goals, then you really won't make much progress on it. So in the last 3 years, I've sort of been mostly focusing on flow, and around 2012, I stumbled upon a personal workflow that is highly influenced by David Allen's Getting Things Done. And ever since then, I've seen my productivity skyrocket very considerably. And it, at this point, is so, even on a period of high sleep deprivation and low glucose levels, I can have a flow state that's 12 plus hours. And these are just a list. So I've tried a bunch of things for monitoring flow state and for tracking all of my projects. These are some of the things that I've used to look at it. However, if you'll see the last item on the list, basically, no matter what software you use, no matter what programs you use, they're kind of don't really matter. What really the core of my own strategy has to do with paper and taking notes. So yes, it is really just that simple. So in terms of productivity, this is going to be the agenda for the talk. These are the key. These are the key areas that you really need to pay attention to, and if you pay attention to them, and I'll explain exactly how each of them affects productivity. But I find that all of these areas have the biggest effect on getting your projects done over long-term projects and allowing you to do a complex amount of projects and keep them going through time. So the biggest thing about long-term project completion has to do with your strategy for taking notes. And honestly, the top thing is super, super important. Everyone assumes that they're just going to remember where they were in their projects the next day. But what I found is that the less you make your brain do, the more productive you are. So like my sort of rule of thumb is when I'm writing a note, write it as if I'm going to hand it off to an assistant who isn't knowledgeable in my field. So like using complete sentences, like basically just assuming A, that I'm like not going to remember tomorrow, and also assuming that I'm going to be way slower than I would be. So if you go into working on a project thinking that it's going to take you like a while, your method of tracking and writing down your progress is going to be different because you're going to assume that it's going to be spread out over a period of days. The other super key to when you're taking notes on projects has to do with your note-taking strategy. So this third one is action contexts are very important. There's a big difference between the notes you take that is like general reference about your project and the things that you need to do in order to push it forward. So for me, I tend to, when I'm taking notes on things, when I have an action that I need to do, I tend to put an arrow in front of it and then write the thing. So when I'm looking over my notes in the future, I can visually pick out, oh, action. And it leads, later when you're processing all of your notes, it makes it go much faster. This one is also super important. So you're working on a project and you need to go do something else. Most people kind of just like put all their papers together and like leave, but it's very important before you lose it and move on to the next activity is to write down, oh, this is what I've completed, this is what I think the next steps are, because otherwise when you go back to it, chances are you're gonna have to redo that thinking. So the goal of my workflow that's really improved my productivity is in the moment doing as many steps as I possibly can so that I don't have to redo any thinking. Because oftentimes, and you find this with people who are filing papers and other paperwork, they tend to go through things again and again because they're not making decisions on it. They're not identifying what it is and what they plan to do on it. I mean, it's hard. The review frequently is a way to make it not as hard, because if you are looking over your notes again and again, you can pull out things that you've missed. You can, if you've made the wrong decision about how you're going to file it according to action, like you can review that. And then you don't have to feel as like stuck in whatever decision you've made at any moment, because after repetition, many times, you realize that making the decisions, like if you can go back and redo them, they don't have as much cognitive weight to them. So key to being really productive is not just having a bunch of like random notes on things, like really separating off what all of your actual physical actions to accomplish a project are. And so action context, like when you focus on action context, it will like dramatically change your perspective. People tend to, when you see this with people running errands, is they tend to batch process a lot of errands and they do them like all at once and get them all done. But you don't see that kind of perspective often carried into other things. And it's true for errands, it's also true for other things. Like you tend to have a lot of calls to make and it's faster to do them all at once. It's not just faster, it also takes less, it takes less motivation to do it because you're sort of on a roll. And like, you know, some people making calls might be difficult, but if you have a list of calls after you've made the first call, you're like, okay, I can do this and I can keep plugging along. The other big mistake that I tend to see in a lot of my clients is their lists become these giant clunky things that sort of represent like dreams and ambitions, and your action list should really be what your goals are right now. Like, do not put, like, have a cold storage file for stuff that you want to work on someday and not now, because having a lot of things on your list is going to be overwhelming. And you really want to have a complete picture of what your goals are and how much you as a person can sort of handle it at any given time. And you can always relook over the someday maybe files, like in the future on a regular repeated basis. So for me, someday maybe is actually a category that's separate from and is reviewed less frequently than my other action categories. Another problem that I tend to see in my clients is people know that they have a lot to do and they often feel overworked and busy. But if you were to ask them, oh, like, what do you deal with on a regular basis? They probably couldn't tell you very concisely. And it's actually really important to think about the kind of information that you are bombarded with and what you actually care about. So by defining your information channels, like, do you get mail? Do you process a lot of mail? Email? Do you do a lot of physical? Like, are you dealing with files and papers? Are you, where's the bulk of your time being spent, and in what media? And once you sort of know that, you can start looking at the kind of content that's coming in, and how often it's coming in, and actually how it relates to your own projects and goals. This is the use value right here. And start to evaluate the time that you're spending on various things. And if you're spending hours and hours a day on email, but the stuff that you're actually dealing with in the email is not totally or very related to your major goals, then you can start to cut that back and like focus on the things that actually matter to you. So again, to talk about action context, the reason why defining the next physical action is really important is because that's all projects are just the only way you complete something is through a series of actions. And most of the time when you have a project that's like been going on forever and just like going nowhere, it's because you haven't made a decision somewhere. So if everyone, like one of the exercises I do with my clients is I have them write down a list of the 5 projects that they really want to do but haven't been making much progress on. And then I tell them in a sentence, describe what the next thing you could actually physically do to move this project forward. And all of a sudden, in the act of making that one sentence, they feel a lot more motivated to like work on their project, and then they start seeing more and more progress. Which brings me to this one. Just because at some point in time something was important to you and you wrote it down doesn't mean you have to commit to it. It's very, very, very important to give yourself the flexibility to change your mind. So if you rigidly adhere that everything you write down you have to do, you're basically going to be spending your time on things that could have some value, but like really aren't pushing you where you want to go as fast as you possibly can. So this, I see in a lot of my clients that I go to, because I do house visits. So I go to people's houses and I go to their home offices and I look at them. And what I see a lot is piles of papers. And I ask them, I was like, oh, so what's in that pile? And they're just like, oh, it's this and maybe some of this. And then we sort through it and then we're just like, oh crap, there's way more things in there than you thought. And the importance of having a small number of collection bins for unsorted items is every time you have a stack of things that's more than one type of thing and you don't know exactly what it is, it uses psychic energy. Like, these are the things that slow you down and you don't realize that they're slowing you down. And as soon as you define and process the things that you have like lying around, the more brain space you can use to actually like working on the things that you need to work on. So what this is mostly referring to is inboxes. My method kind of relies on having one or two inboxes. I have a physical one, and then I have my email inbox where I put items that I know have something that need to be done with them. Like they go in there until I'm able to like sit down and make all those decisions, because the act of making decisions about some undefined item actually takes like a bit of cognitive energy. And again, the batch processing makes it a lot easier when you're like dealing with, oh, this goes here, this goes here, this goes here, like, and having it very close to where you actually store your, like where you store your action lists or your other project support material is like very important, because you don't want the act of sorting your inbox to be psychically this like grueling like ordeal. So a little earlier I mentioned about not feeling like you need to adhere to anything that you've written down at any time. So basically, the thing that I try and remember is that I'm going to die. You guys are all going to die. And not only that, there is so much to experience and do that like even if you could clone yourself, you could not do it because it's constantly expanding. So while this on its own level is very scary, it can also be the fuel that you need to make the decisions about what you want to work on and why. Because like ideally you're working and you're like in a flow state. That losing track of time thing that I was talking about before, you need to have some sort of method to like rein you in. Otherwise it'll be like 12 hours later and you could be progressing on like one thing but have neglected other needs. So what I tend to do when I like start my day is I look at sort of how many hours I have, like where my brain is, because you can't always do any given activity at any given time. Like sometimes you may not have the kind of brain power to write an email to someone. So you just need to make sure that the activity you're working on best suits your brain. So a lot of people think that getting a better software will help them be more productive, but really that's not true. Productivity has to do with your own self and motivations and making sure that you know what your goals are. So if you're wondering why you're not moving, chances are it's you. And so you should step back and try and figure out how you're getting in your way. Which leads me to my next thought. Basically, the next thing I'm going to be looking at in terms of productivity is how to deal with emotions that are overwhelming and stop you from working. Like, my productivity method is fine and all, but it doesn't deal very well with what happens when you're really depressed and can't work. So looking forward to the future, my next area of sort of research is these areas, but mostly like emotional control and working through emotions to keep your productivity levels up. That's it. Are there any questions? Yeah.
So, you want to come to my house and be my efficiency expert? Because I have a question. When you work with clients, can you figure out who has attention problems, attention deficit, and what tools? I mean, that's a pretty tricky area.
Yeah, I actually, all of my clients have some sort of brain abnormality. Sounds really strong, but like I have several clients with ADD. I actually have one client who has, as a result of having epilepsy, has had many brain injuries, and so is dealing with less, but she's also a brilliant writer, and so in dealing with losing parts of her brain, like is working sort of with, I help her find skills to deal with the parts that she's lost. Like she can't do hierarchical processing. So there's ways around dealing with who you are and how that's getting in your way, basically. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Do you meditate?
I do meditate, actually.
Thank you for answering that person's question.
Yeah? procrastinate, actually, I have a great Augustin Burroughs quote about procrastination. Where there is willpower, there is a Band-Aid that's eventually going to fall off. You only need willpower to get what you don't want or what you only want to want. By want to want, I mean something you wish you wanted but don't really. What I find is a lot of the time procrastination is feeling like I need to do something that I don't actually have to do or want to do. So I basically, when there's a, and this is, my meditation practice actually comes in handy here, is like when there's something that I'm just like, why am I not doing this? I tend to sit back and sit on the feeling, and there are roots there are actually much deeper roots that when you're procrastinating on something, you have to solve something inside yourself before you can make progress on it. Does that make sense?
If I may make a poll here, is that a common problem here?
So you're saying is it common to feel procrastinate?
I mean, if you find that you're systematically procrastinating, you should look at the kind of tasks that you're doing that you tend to be procrastinating on. There are patterns as to why you're slower on some things than you want to be. And like once you start to get the sense of the patterns, then you can start to look at what you need to change in order to have that not be the case.
So other than hiring you to like help me on that, is there any like resources you could direct me to actually try to go through that process?
Yeah, so in terms of emotional, like dealing with like procrastination, like emotional issues, Pema Chodron is like my favorite Buddhist monk of all time, and she really deals with sort of looking at things inside yourself that are stopping you from doing things. But in terms of organization and productivity, David Allen's Getting Things Done is like really awesome. Minus the fact that he's like 10 years too old, so he only kind of talks about physical processing and he doesn't really go into the electronic sphere of data.
Why don't we take the rest of the questions offline?
Sure.
Okay, thank you so much.